Hi gang, Rob here. It's the afternoon of 24 October 2017. Have a From the Sharpening Bench video for you all today. This one on a relatively new offering from Lionstreel Knives, Maniago, Italy. And what we're looking at today is the SR-11A OS. That's for orange handle satin finished blade, I believe. Let's take a look inside, shall we? We have a poly bag that houses a knife and the typical Lionstreel pivot slash pocket clip wrench. Looks like it had a little tag on it at one point. But you know, the packaging is not the story with this knife. The story with this knife is the knife. And here it is. This is the latest variant in Lionstreel's SR series. I believe they call it their solid knife series. Integral frames. And this knife, like the earlier SR1 and SR2, are made both in titanium frame lock integral handles and aluminum integral frame lock handles. This is a beautiful glossy hard orange anodized aluminum frame. I love the aluminum frame SRs. I suppose you could make a case that titanium makes a little bit better lock bar spring material than aluminum does, but I've never had a problem with one. And with the steel lock bar insert, it really doesn't care what surface or which material you have, because neither the titanium nor the aluminum are coming in contact with the tang of the blade, the lock interface. So obviously we have some different machining than we've seen on the other SRs, and we have a little bit different blade too. But neither the milling nor the blade are the real story. The real story here is we have ball bearings and a flipper instead of thumb stud on Teflon washers, okay? So the SR-11, a pretty cool evolution, I think, in the SR series. Before we get to the blade, I want to talk about this pivot. And you guys have heard me sort of rant about integral framed knives, integral handled knives being a solution in search of a problem, and I still believe that. And frankly, the Lionstreel SR1 and SR2 created more problems than they solved. The SR-11, I think, marries two technologies that need to be married. If you're going to run an integral handle, I think you really need a ball bearing pivot, because the tension and width dimension between the scales or frame sides is so variable because of stresses in machining, and you know, you're not putting two perfectly flat pieces of titanium or aluminum together with a backspacer or standoffs and keeping everything precise. So, you know, there's a lot of milling going on, a lot of heat generated, a lot of stresses generated, and these two sides of the handle, they vary wildly. So you're depending on pivot tension if those two halves are spread to hold everything together. If the two halves are pinched, you kind of need a pivot mechanism that's going to be able to be under a lot of pressure and still have a free action. So the ball bearing pivot obviously lends itself to this application. The ball bearing pivot, by the way, very well done. Caged steel ball bearings and hardened steel washers to back them up so you don't have ball bearings riding on the surface of that anodized aluminum. A little trickier to assemble than a similar knife that doesn't have backing washers. You sort of have to assemble it like a Benchmade axis lock. You start with the pivot out, you poke it through just a little bit, you catch one of the backing washers, then you slide the blade and bearings in over that, push the pivot a little bit more through, and then you can slide the top backing washer over. So there are no recesses, obviously, in the aluminum handle to accommodate those. It would be impossible to mill them. So they're just sort of hanging out on top of the bearings as that stack is assembled. Okay, there is a lip around the bearing side of each of those backing washers that keeps them sort of over the bearings and keeps dirt and grit out of the bearings too, I would imagine. So pretty well designed pivot, I think. It seems to work admirably. You have a nice free dropping blade. Now the way I've got this one adjusted, it does not drop shut. It's not going to guillotine your fingers. It's kind of right where it needs to be for good blade centering. This might favor away from the lock side just a hair. I could probably tighten it a little more and get it perfect. Pivot tightness does seem to affect blade centering in this particular SR-11A. But the pivot and the handle engineering, design, and execution seem to work very well together. Here's another thing that works very well. The flipping action. Different than the Lionstreel Kerr, this can be a pure push button flipper. It can also be a really good light switch flipper. Does both equally well. It's not the fastest flipping knife in the world, but it's certainly reliable. And also, no death detent. I can put my fingers on the lock bar, knife still flips. Also, when closing, I put my thumb in a natural place on the lock bar, I push it over, I put the flipper on my thumbnail, and we are past the detent ball. We are past the detent ball. Beautiful thing, beautiful thing. So many flippers get that wrong. So in really every aspect, the flippability of this knife is right on the money. Construction is pretty standard Lionstreel. You've got that floating stop pin attached with one screw on the lock side of the knife. The other end just sort of floats through the frame. Very good positive location of that pin. It does its job admirably well. It's shouldered in both sides. No strength concerns there. No jimping on the flipper, and it's not a super big flipper. It's a flipper that's super comfortable. It does stay out of the way pretty well. Not very obtrusive in pocket. You know, if you sort of draw a tangent to this line of the back of the knife, the flipper is really below that line, so it stays out of the way very well in the pocket. Of course, the machining and finishing of the handle is standard Lionstreel, which is to say, beautiful. Ergos over the original SR, virtually unchanged. There's no jimping on this blade, though. There was on the SR1 and 2. Not sure it needs it with the self-guard in the handle and then the flipper tab protruding as a further guard. Everything's beautiful. I believe they changed the glass breaker on this knife. You guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe the SR1 and 2 had a carbide tip on the glass breaker. This one does. Same wonderful clip, tip up, right or left hand carry. Very short, very secure, very out of the way, and it disappears as you grip the knife. The ergos of the handle are great as always. A saber grip is super comfortable. A hammer grip is super comfortable. Draw cut grip very good. And a reverse grip. Even with that carbide tip, it's short enough that even if you wrap your thumb right over it, it doesn't seem to cause much of a problem. But if it bothered you, you could just go like that with the thumb, and the guard of the knife is going to keep your hand from sliding forward in a stabbing motion. Okay, now let's talk about the blade, and oh my, did they do a nice job on this blade. Let me wipe it off just in case I've got any lingering fingerprints. Now this one came to me for sharpening, as you probably have already gathered. And the owner did try to sharpen this himself. He worked on that convex Lionstreel geometry, and boy, he really kind of scratched up the blade. So although this looks really good, this is not the original Lionstreel satin. This is my refinish, although I think it looks just about exactly like the factory finish. It's a nice satin, whether it's mine or whether it's theirs. But here, look at this, guys. I think a much improved blade. over the SR1. A little more drop in the drop point, I think, makes the knife a little more attractive. It makes it a little better piercer. The swedge in the top of the blade is super attractive. You still have a crown spine, and that crown continues even in the swedged portion of the knife. I think the symmetry is pretty good on this one. Take a look at the tip, see how we terminate. Yeah, it's pretty good. Very, very nice. One other thing, well, two other things I noticed about this blade that makes me like it a little better than the SR1. If you remember, the SR1 was very straight, or very consistent in thickness from the base of the blade out to about here where the belly started, and then there was a really pronounced hump where the distal taper started. Not that geometrically it was bad, but this just flows better. The distal taper is much more gradual coming to the end, and I think it helps Lionstreel get a little more consistent thickness at the edge. If you notice the width of my bevel, it's pretty doggone consistent. This one was sharpened at 17 degrees per side with a little kiss at 20 for a micro bevel. It probably would look better if I had done it at 18, but I had to sort of cover up some prior sharpening by the owner. Wanted to make sure I cleaned up all his marks. So now, slicing geometry, I like it at 17. Aesthetically, it might look better with a little less bevel width, but I think the blade's broad enough it handles it very well. It does cut like crazy. So, steel is unchanged, at least in the titanium version. The aluminum version of the SR1 had D2. Both versions of the smaller knife, the SR2 and SR-2A, got Sleipner. This one has Sleipner. I really like it a lot. Sleipner, it seems to be a little finer grained steel than D2 that it sort of emulates. It is no more corrosion resistant than D2. I found that out with my Kerr, and here's how it cuts at 17 degrees per side. Boy, you got to keep the knife in the paper, you know? Yeah, that'll work. Just a really, really, really nice steel if you take care of your blade and don't let it rust. Don't ride it hard and put it away wet, boys. One thing about Lionstreel, they know how to make a blade look beautiful. And this one certainly does. Just a superb all-purpose blade shape. Enough straight to do anything, any kind of food prep that you need to do, cutting on a cutting board or something. Enough belly for superb slicing. Like I said, with a little more drop in that spine, a little bit better piercer than the SR1 series. I really only have two complaints about this knife, well, maybe three. They're carryovers from the original SRs. The roto block, I think, is a little funky. You know, I don't think you really need it. You rotate this knife and you rotate the roto block and it keeps the lock bar from being disengaged. They're kind of finicky, you know. If the screw gets loose, sometimes they engage when you don't want them to. I don't know. On my SRs, I've always just backed off the roto block and cranked the screw down so they don't move. Another thing, they've got the same lock bar insert that I think has been a problem from day one. Just like the SR1 and 2, the SR has what appears to be an unhardened steel lock bar insert that is carbidized. So you have a very granular surface meeting up to a precisely milled blade tang surface that appears to be backed by something kind of soft, because sometimes you get lock stick on a steel inserted knife. I don't understand. This one doesn't have it, but lots of SR1s and 2s I've handled and sharpened have lock stick. It's just mind-boggling to me why you would use a steel insert and then carbonize it and still have lock stick. Something's going on there. I'm not sure what. I'm guessing they didn't harden the insert, but just a guess. And then they also have, and it's an integral, so I'm not sure how you get away from this. Well, yeah, I do. You have that pivot that is not restrained on the female side. So, and unless you get your Loctite job done perfectly, sometimes the pivots tend to loosen. You could actually do this if you use some kind of you can't make a D-shaped through hole very easily. That's very difficult to do on an integral, I understand that. But we could make, like an old Kershaw, a hex-shaped head and mill a hex pocket in the handle, or like the ZT-0804, the head is D-shaped, which works just fine. Sometimes that's a problem, sometimes it's not. All in all, just a superb descendant of the SR-1 is the 11, or 11A in this case. I like it a lot. The blade just seems to be more svelte, more beautiful, less huge. By the way, dimensions haven't changed. The blade is 3 3/4 inches long, 180 thousandths stock. 4 5/8 or so is the handle, which gives it great blade to handle ratio. You can see how close the pivot is to the front of the handle. So 3 3/4 blade, 4 5/8 handle. So you only lose 7/8 of an inch in blade to handle ratio. Sort of 1 inch difference between blade and handle is sort of the benchmark, I think, for efficiency. And this is better than that. Very nicely done. Price, I think, is pretty good. For the aluminum model, heck, I think they're priced less than the SR-1s were when they came out. So these are $190-ish. And I think the handles are going to come in a variety of colors. I don't know if they're all the same as the SR-1s were, but those were what? Black, green, orange, and red. And then also a black-coated blade should be available, I believe. And then you got your titanium-handled version without the A in the model number. Those, I think, are $346 MAP pricing. So a significant cost savings as usual if you opt for the aluminum frame rather than the titanium. I think you get an awful lot of knife for under $200 here. Just nice work by Lionstreel. Very impressive. That's all for this one, my friends. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. And remember, the word is sharp.